The courtroom was quiet, almost too quiet except for the occasional shuffle of papers or the soft cough of someone trying not to draw attention. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows on the polished wooden benches. The air smelled faintly of old books, ink, and polished wood. Everyone was waiting, holding their breath, as though the walls themselves knew that today would be different. The judge sat at the bench, tall and imposing, with a gavel resting beside him. His eyes scanned the room, sharp and careful, missing nothing. People in the courtroom knew he commanded respect. Even seasoned lawyers, those who had spent decades in courtrooms, felt the weight of his presence. Today he was overseeing a serious case, one that had drawn attention from all over the city. The details were complicated, and the tension could be cut with a knife. On one of the benches sat a young boy, no more than 10 years old, fidgeting slightly in his seat. He was small, with dark hair that fell over his forehead, and his eyes were wide, taking in everything around him. He was not here by accident. His family had brought him along, partly out of necessity, partly because they wanted him to understand the seriousness of what was happening. But even they had no idea that he would end up doing something no one in that courtroom would ever forget. The accused sat nearby, his hands clenched together, looking nervous. His lawyer whispered something in his ear and he nodded, trying to mask his fear with a forced calm. Across the room, the prosecutor reviewed notes, preparing to make their argument with precision. The courtroom staff adjusted papers, whispered to each other, and tried to keep the room in order, but a quiet tension hung like fog. The boy's eyes moved from the accused to the judge and then back to the lawyers. Something about the way the proceedings unfolded stirred him. He didn't fully understand all the legal words or the complicated arguments, but he could sense the truth, or maybe the lack of it. He noticed the small details adults seemed to overlook. The way a hand trembled slightly when certain words were spoken. The flicker of guilt or fear in someone's eyes. The boy had an instinct, sharp and clear, that something was off. The judge's voice finally broke the silence. "We will proceed," he said, firm and steady. "All parties will have their chance to speak and we will find the truth." His tone was commanding, leaving no room for argument. People in the courtroom nodded, some whispering quietly to each other about how serious the case had become. The boy listened carefully, noting every word. Hours passed as the lawyers presented their points. The judge listened, asking questions here and there, his pen moving across a notepad as he wrote down observations. The accused tried to answer calmly, but his nerves betrayed him. Even the adults in the room, who had handled tense situations before, felt the pressure in the air. The boy watched quietly, feeling a strange mix of fear and curiosity. He didn't feel out of place. Somehow he felt he belonged there, as if he could see things adults were too busy or too afraid to notice. At one point, the boy's mother leaned over and whispered, "Sit still, please. Don't interrupt." He nodded but didn't look away. His attention was fixed entirely on the judge and the accused. There was a part of him that wanted to speak, to say something, but he didn't know if it was allowed. Still, a growing sense inside him told him he couldn't stay silent if he saw the truth being hidden. Then it happened. A minor detail during the questioning caught the boy's attention. A small lie, almost invisible, had slipped out. The judge didn't notice it immediately, focused as he was on the bigger parts of the case. But the boy noticed. He felt a surge of courage. For a moment, he hesitated. What if he said something wrong? What if the judge scolded him? But then he remembered why he was there. He remembered the truth he wanted to protect. His small hand clenched into a fist as he made a decision he could not take back. He stood up slowly, deliberately. All eyes turned toward him immediately. Gasps filled the room. The murmurs rose like a small storm. "What is he doing?" someone whispered. The lawyers froze mid-sentence, papers rustling nervously. The judge, initially calm and composed, blinked in surprise. No one expected a child to interrupt the proceedings, not here, not now, not in a courtroom that demanded order above all else. The boy took a few steps forward. His heart pounded, but his face was steady. He looked up at the judge, who leaned forward slightly, trying to gauge what the boy intended. The room fell silent again, every single person holding their breath. Even the accused looked confused, unsure whether to be worried or amazed. The boy opened his mouth, ready to speak, feeling the weight of every eye on him. And then he said the words that would change everything. The boy's small voice cut through the tense silence of the courtroom. It was clear, calm, and confident. Two simple words, yet they carried a weight that no adult could ignore. Every head turned, every eye fixed on him. Even the judge, usually unshakable and composed, froze mid-sentence. His pen hovered over his notepad as if it too had paused to listen. For a moment, the courtroom seemed to stop breathing. The murmurs faded. The papers on the desks remained untouched, and the only sound was the boy's quiet but firm declaration. People stared, some in shock, others in disbelief. The accused's face drained of color, and even the lawyers, who were used to surprises in court, felt a strange chill run down their spines. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression shifting from curiosity to something deeper, recognition. He blinked rapidly as if trying to process what he had just heard. There was something about those two words that struck him at a level deeper than words could explain, something truthful, undeniable, and completely unexpected. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with tension moments before, now felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the judge to react. Whispers started to ripple through the room. "Did he just say that?" One observer muttered under their breath. "Is that possible?" Another whispered. The boy didn't flinch. He stood there, small but steady, his eyes unwavering as they met the judge's. He had no idea of the chaos his words had unleashed. But he knew one thing. He had spoken the truth. The judge's hands, which had been gripping the edges of the bench, loosened slightly. He stared at the boy, pale and silent, as if the very core of his authority had been challenged in the most innocent yet powerful way. For years he had presided over countless cases, seen lies twisted, witnessed adults hiding behind words and excuses, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this, a child cutting through all of it with simple honesty. The accused shifted in his seat, glancing between his lawyer and the judge. His confidence, which had been wavering already, now shattered completely. The subtle mask he had been wearing crumbled, revealing fear and guilt in its rawest form. The lawyers whispered hurriedly to each other, trying to regain control, but the boy's words had disrupted everything. It was not just a disruption. It was a revelation. The boy's mother, sitting quietly on a bench nearby, clutched her hands together. She felt a mix of pride and anxiety. She had always known her son was perceptive, but seeing him stand up in front of the entire courtroom fearless was something she could never have imagined. Her heart raced as she wondered how far this moment would go and what consequences, if any, would follow. The judge finally spoke, his voice a little unsteady but commanding still. "Young man," he said slowly, almost carefully, "what exactly do you mean by that?" The entire courtroom leaned in, eager for an explanation. The boy took a deep breath, his small chest rising and falling with determination. He repeated the two words, slightly louder this time, making sure everyone could hear. And as he did, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't just surprise anymore. It was understanding. Those two words, simple as they were, illuminated a truth that had been hidden from the room until that very moment. The judge's face, pale just seconds before, now held a mixture of realization and shock. He had seen many things in his life, but honesty from a child had a power unlike anything else. The lawyers and spectators began to process the moment. The courtroom, which had been tense and formal, now buzzed quietly with a mix of admiration and disbelief. People exchanged glances, nodding slightly as if acknowledging that something significant had just occurred. The boy didn't fully understand the impact, but he knew that he had done something important. The judge's eyes flickered across the room, scanning the faces of everyone present. He looked back at the boy and spoke again, his voice firmer this time, though still carrying the weight of the moment. "It seems someone here has spoken the truth that many have missed," he said. His tone commanded respect, but it was also tinged with humility. For the first time that day, he was not just a judge asserting authority. He was a man confronting truth in its purest form. The accused's lawyer tried to regain composure. "Your Honor," the lawyer began, "this is a minor point." The judge raised a hand, cutting him off. His eyes never left the boy. "No," he said firmly. "This is not minor. This is crucial." The courtroom fell silent again, every single person listening intently. The boy, standing there with quiet courage, had shifted the entire balance of the trial. People whispered to each other about the boy. Some shook their heads in disbelief. How could someone so young have such insight? How could the truth be revealed in two simple words? It was almost magical, yet undeniably real. The boy had not planned to disrupt the courtroom. He had only spoken what he knew in his heart was right, and in doing so he had changed everything. The judge leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the bench. His gaze softened, but there was still intensity in his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly, almost to himself. Then he addressed the boy directly. "You have said something that needed to be said. Please sit down now and allow the court to continue, but know that your words have had an impact far beyond what most adults could imagine." The boy nodded, a mix of relief and pride washing over him. He returned to his seat quietly as though nothing had happened, but everyone in the courtroom knew otherwise. The air still felt charged, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of those two words. The trial could continue, but nothing would ever be the same. Even the judge, now slightly composed but still pale, made a note of the boy's courage. For the first time in years, he had felt challenged not by arguments or evidence, but by honesty. And in that moment, he understood that truth could come from the smallest voice. The youngest person in the room, and that power, when used wisely, was unstoppable. The courtroom slowly resumed its proceedings, but the energy had shifted. People spoke more carefully, watched more closely, and even the accused seemed more aware of his own actions. The boy remained seated, his eyes focused on the judge, but his mind wandered. He did not realize that this single act, simple as it seemed, had already made him a part of something much larger than himself. And as the day went on, the judge occasionally glanced at the boy, a subtle nod of acknowledgement passing between them. That nod, simple and quiet, carried respect, recognition, and understanding. The boy had done what adults often struggled to do. He had spoken truth with courage. And in doing so, he had changed the course of an entire courtroom. The courtroom seemed frozen for a few moments after the boy had returned to his seat. People whispered softly, exchanging glances, some still unable to fully grasp what had just happened. The judge, normally calm and composed, leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the wooden bench, a habit he had whenever he was deep in thought. But this time his usual composure was gone. His face remained pale, almost white, as if the boy's words had stripped away the layers of authority he carefully maintained. Inside the judge's mind, a storm of thoughts was raging. He had presided over countless cases, handled arguments, interrogated witnesses, and maintained control over the court with an iron will. But the boy had done something unexpected, something that no amount of training or experience could prepare him for. The truth, delivered in its simplest form, had a weight that textbooks and legal procedures could never match. The accused sat frozen, staring at the boy as if seeing him for the first time. There was fear in his eyes, a fear that came not from the law itself but from exposure. The words the boy had spoken had revealed a crack in the carefully built wall of lies and pretenses. It was subtle yet powerful, and it was impossible to ignore. His lawyer leaned in, whispering hurriedly, trying to restore some control, but even the adult seemed shaken by the boy's audacity. Spectators in the courtroom murmured quietly among themselves. Some whispered about the bravery of the child, others about the impact his words had on the case. One elderly woman shook her head slowly, saying under her breath, "Such courage, at such a young age." The boy's mother clenched her hands in her lap, her chest tight with pride and anxiety. She wanted to smile, to tell him how proud she was, but she also feared what might happen next. The judge finally cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "We will proceed," he said, his voice steady but tinged with a new awareness. He looked directly at the accused. "However, I will need everyone to take a closer look at the facts, now that certain truths have been highlighted." His words carried a weight they had not held before. A seriousness that signaled this case had shifted in a subtle yet undeniable way. The lawyers resumed their arguments, but the energy in the courtroom had changed. Every gesture, every word seemed to be measured more carefully. The boy's small act had shifted the balance of power. No longer was this simply a trial of legal arguments and evidence. It had become a test of honesty, perception, and human insight. The judge's glances toward the boy were frequent, almost reverent, as though he could not believe the clarity that had come from such an unexpected source. The accused tried to maintain composure, but each look from the judge reminded him that his words were being scrutinized in a way he hadn't anticipated. Sweat formed on his forehead, and his hands tightened nervously around the edges of the table. Even subtle gestures betrayed him now. His shifting eyes, the twitch of a finger, the quick inhalation before responding. It was clear to everyone, including the judge, that the boy's observation had pierced through the carefully maintained facade. Meanwhile, the courtroom staff adjusted their positions, trying to continue the trial smoothly. But they too were affected by what had happened. The court clerk paused slightly before passing documents. The bailiff's footsteps seemed heavier, and the atmosphere, though still formal, had an undercurrent of something extraordinary. People were no longer just observing a legal process. They were witnessing a moment where honesty, courage, and human instinct had altered the course of events. The boy, still seated, felt a strange mixture of pride and nervousness. He did not fully understand the full extent of what he had done, but he sensed that the atmosphere had changed. The judge no longer seemed untouchable, the accused no longer invincible, and the courtroom no longer a place where only adults could hold power. For the first time, the boy felt that his voice, his simple observation, had mattered in a real and profound way. The judge called for a short recess, a pause that allowed everyone to gather their thoughts. People moved quietly, some talking in low tones, others simply staring at the boy, realizing that in this small figure, there was a clarity that many adults lacked. The accused whispered urgently to his lawyer, but the words felt hollow, as if they were trying to patch over a truth that could not be hidden. In the judge's chambers, he sat alone for a moment, thinking deeply. He recalled every case he had ever presided over, every witness who had misled him, every lie that had gone unnoticed. He realized in that quiet moment that the simplest truths were often the hardest to hear. And today a child had spoken such a truth with nothing but honesty and courage. His face remained pale, his mind racing as he considered how to proceed. He needed to ensure that justice would be served, but he also needed to acknowledge the extraordinary way it had been revealed. The boy's mother watched him closely during the recess. She was filled with mixed emotions, pride, worry, and amazement. She knew her son had a keen sense of perception, but seeing it expressed so boldly in front of an entire courtroom was something she could never have imagined. People around her whispered, nodding in admiration, and some even smiled at the boy, as if acknowledging that he had reminded them of the power of innocence and honesty. When the recess ended, the courtroom reconvened with a renewed sense of purpose. The judge's tone had softened slightly but carried more weight. "We will now examine the evidence once more," he said, his eyes briefly meeting the boy's. "Every detail will be considered carefully." The boy felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had not intended to disrupt the trial or challenge authority, but his words had shifted the focus back to truth, something the courtroom needed desperately. As the proceedings continued, the boy noticed the subtle changes in behavior. The lawyers spoke more carefully. The accused hesitated before answering, and even the witnesses seemed more aware of the importance of honesty. The judge, though still commanding, now listened differently. He asked questions with a deeper understanding, probing for truth in ways that went beyond legal strategy. It was clear that the boy's intervention had altered the dynamics in the room permanently. By the end of the day, the boy had become an unexpected figure of influence in the courtroom. Though he remained quiet and small, his presence was felt everywhere. People left the courtroom talking softly about the courage of a child who had spoken truth in a place dominated by adults. The judge's expression, though controlled, still held traces of the shock and admiration he had felt moments before. The boy, for his part, returned home that evening unaware of the full impact he had made, but satisfied in the simple knowledge that he had done what he believed was right. And so, Part 3 closes with the courtroom forever changed, the judge reflecting on honesty, the accused unsettled, and the boy quietly becoming the unexpected center of a story that was only beginning to unfold. The courtroom slowly settled back into its formal rhythm, but something had undeniably changed. The energy was different, heavier, charged with a mix of curiosity, respect, and a touch of fear. The boy had returned to his seat, small and quiet, but everyone could feel his presence. His 2 words had shaken the room, and though no one could fully articulate it, the impact was clear. The truth had been spoken, and now nothing could be the same. The judge sat upright, his usual stern expression softened by the weight of what had just happened. He cleared his throat and looked around the courtroom carefully. "We will continue," he said, his voice firm but thoughtful. "Every statement, every piece of evidence will now be examined with the utmost care. Let this court be reminded that the truth is never minor. The lawyer shifted uneasily. The accused's lawyer whispered something to him, trying to maintain control, but it was clear that the tide had turned. The accused himself looked more anxious now, eyes darting nervously at the judge, at the boy, and even at the people sitting silently on the benches. Every subtle movement felt amplified in the charged atmosphere. The boy watched quietly, trying to understand what was happening. He didn't fully comprehend the legal implications of what he had said, but he felt a quiet satisfaction. His words, simple as they were, had drawn attention to a truth no one else seemed willing or able to see. And now it was as if the adults around him were beginning to see what he had seen all along. The first witness returned to the stand. Normally, this would have been routine, a series of questions, answers, and evidence presented. But now the atmosphere had shifted. The witness hesitated, clearly aware of the scrutiny in the room. The boy's simple act had reminded everyone that dishonesty would be noticed, even if it came from small gestures or slight inconsistencies. The witness answered more cautiously, choosing words carefully, and the judge listened intently, eyes flicking occasionally toward the boy as if seeking confirmation or guidance from his observation. The accused's lawyer tried to steer the case back on track, emphasizing technicalities and legalities. "Your Honor, may I remind the court," the judge raised a hand, cutting him off. His voice was calm but authoritative. "We are reminded today that details matter. Every word spoken here will be considered not just for legality, but for truth. Please proceed, but with full honesty." The boy felt a ripple of pride. He had not meant to change the proceedings entirely. He had only spoken what he believed. Yet now the trial itself seemed to respect his perspective. Adults, seasoned in law and argument, were now navigating the courtroom with heightened awareness, acutely conscious that the smallest truth could have enormous consequences. Even the courtroom spectators leaned in, attentive and hushed. The murmurs were gone. People watched with anticipation. They could sense that this was no ordinary day, no ordinary trial. Something extraordinary had happened. A reminder that truth could pierce even the most rigid structures of authority, and that courage sometimes came from unexpected sources. The judge paused to review notes. His face, though still pale from the shock, reflected contemplation and care. He had realized that this trial was no longer just about evidence or legal arguments. It had become about integrity, honesty, and human insight. And he now understood that the boy, in his innocence, had exposed a critical layer of truth that adults had overlooked. The accused's demeanor had shifted completely. Gone was the tentative confidence he had tried to maintain. Now he fidgeted in his seat, avoiding the judge's eyes, glancing at the boy with a mixture of fear and confusion. It was clear that the boy's words had unsettled him more than any legal argument could have. The accused knew deep down that the boy had seen through his carefully constructed facade. The judge called for another short recess. During this pause, the murmurs in the courtroom picked up again, though quieter this time. People whispered about the boy's courage, the audacity of a child who had dared to speak out in a room full of adults, and how those two simple words had reshaped the entire trial. Even the attorneys quietly acknowledged that the boy had shifted the dynamic, forcing everyone to consider not just law but morality and honesty. Outside the courtroom, in a quiet corridor, the boy's mother spoke to him softly. "You were very brave," she said, her voice a mixture of pride and caution. "You spoke the truth, but remember, courts are serious places. Be careful." The boy nodded, not fully understanding the full consequences but feeling a quiet satisfaction. He had acted from instinct, from a sense of fairness, and that alone gave him a feeling of calm power. The judge had noticed. The courtroom had reacted, and in that moment, he realized that courage did not always come with size or age. It came with honesty and conviction. When the court resumed, the judge addressed everyone with a renewed tone. "Let us proceed with clarity and precision. Today has reminded us that truth can be found in the simplest observations. Let no one here underestimate the importance of honesty, no matter how small the voice delivering it may seem." As proceedings continued, every interaction carried subtle but noticeable weight. Witnesses answered more thoughtfully, the lawyers approached arguments with greater care, and even the courtroom staff seemed more attentive. The boy observed quietly, his small hands folded in his lap, understanding at some level that what he had done had ripple effects far beyond his intention. By the end of the day, the courtroom had transformed. It was no longer simply a place of rules and procedures. It had become a place where honesty was visible, where courage, even from the smallest person, was recognized and respected. The boy had returned to his seat, yet his presence lingered everywhere, like an invisible force reminding everyone of the power of truth. The judge, as the day concluded, gave a final glance toward the boy. His expression was serious, but also carried subtle respect. "Remember this day," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Even the smallest voice can reveal the greatest truths." And with that, the courtroom slowly emptied, leaving behind an air of reflection, admiration, and quiet awe. The boy had changed the course of events, not with authority, not with expertise, but with courage, observation, and honesty. Today, everyone had witnessed that even in the most structured and controlled environments, the truth has a way of shining through, and sometimes it comes from the most unexpected sources. As the next day arrived, the courtroom once again filled with people, though the atmosphere was noticeably different. There was a quiet sense of anticipation in the air. Everyone seemed to remember the small boy who had spoken 2 words the previous day, the words that had turned the judge pale and shifted the trial in ways no one had expected. People whispered quietly, some nodding to each other, while others glanced at the boy with curiosity and respect. The judge entered the courtroom with his usual authority, but there was a softness to his expression. His steps were deliberate, and his eyes scanned the room not just for procedure, but for truth. He had spent the night reflecting on the boy's words and the impact they had on the case. For the first time in a long time, he realized that justice was not just about rules and evidence. It was also about honesty, courage, and human insight. The boy sat quietly in the front row, his hands folded, his eyes alert. He did not fully understand the importance of what he had done, but he sensed that people were watching him, waiting for something. There was a strange mixture of fear and pride in his chest. He had acted from instinct, and instinct had shown him the right path. The accused entered the room looking more anxious than before. His face betrayed unease, and he kept glancing toward the boy, as if expecting another revelation. His lawyer whispered hurriedly, trying to calm him, but the tension was palpable. The judge, however, maintained a calm authority, his gaze occasionally drifting toward the boy, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The proceedings began, but the trial now moved at a different pace. Witnesses answered carefully, knowing that every word mattered. Lawyers spoke with more caution, aware that even small inconsistencies could be noticed. The boy's words had reminded everyone that truth was powerful, even when it came from someone young and seemingly insignificant. The judge asked questions that went beyond the surface, probing not just for facts but for honesty. His tone was firm but reflective, showing that he was now listening differently. He seemed more thoughtful, more patient, and more aware of the human element behind every statement. The courtroom responded to this shift, and even the accused seemed to realize that he could no longer rely solely on technicalities or clever arguments. The boy watched quietly, noticing subtle changes in everyone's behavior. The lawyers paused before speaking, the accused hesitated before answering, and the witnesses seemed more self-aware. Even the spectators were more attentive, leaning in to hear every word. It was clear that the boy's simple act of courage had set a new standard for the day's proceedings. As the trial progressed, the boy's mother watched him with quiet pride. She realized that her son had not only spoken the truth, but had also reminded everyone in the room of the importance of honesty and courage. She felt a deep sense of awe at how such a small act could have such a profound impact. The judge finally called for a recess. During this pause, he spoke quietly with the lawyers and staff, emphasizing the need to consider every detail with care. "Today reminds us all that truth can come from the most unexpected places," he said. His words carried weight, and those in the room felt the gravity of the moment. When the trial resumed, the accused's demeanor had changed. He appeared more thoughtful, less confident, and more aware of the importance of honesty. The lawyers adjusted their approach, focusing not just on arguments but on clarity and truthfulness. The courtroom moved forward with a sense of purpose that had been absent before the boy's interruption. By the end of the day, it was clear that the trial had been transformed. The judge made notes carefully, considering not just legal arguments but the human factors that had been revealed. The boy, though quiet and small, had become an unexpected center of attention. not because of authority or experience, but because of courage, perception, and honesty. As the courtroom emptied, people whispered to each other about what had happened. Some were amazed that a child could have such insight. Others were inspired by his bravery. The judge lingered for a moment, reflecting on the events, and then looked toward the boy with a subtle nod of acknowledgement. It was a quiet gesture, but it carried immense respect. The boy returned home that evening with his mother, tired but calm. He did not fully understand the extent of his impact, but he felt a quiet satisfaction. He had spoken the truth, acted with courage, and reminded everyone, including the judge, that honesty could come from anyone, no matter their age. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about the courtroom, the judge, the lawyers, and the accused. He realized that even small actions could create big changes. He felt proud, not because of attention or recognition, but because he had done the right thing. And in that realization, he understood something important. Courage and honesty were powerful tools, sometimes stronger than experience or authority. The next morning, the judge began the proceedings with a renewed perspective. He was more attentive, more thoughtful, and more aware of the human element behind every action. The boy's presence remained a quiet reminder in the room. Adults acted with greater care, knowing that truth and honesty could not be ignored. No matter how small the voice delivering it, the case eventually reached a resolution. But the story of the boy's bravery remained. People spoke of the child who had interrupted the judge with 2 words, changing the course of the trial with honesty and courage. The judge himself reflected on the lesson he had learned, that the smallest voices can reveal the greatest truths, and that integrity should always guide justice. The boy continued to grow, unaware of the full legacy of that day, but carrying with him the knowledge that speaking the truth, even when it is difficult, can make a real difference. And the courtroom, once rigid and formal, remembered that day as the moment when a child's words reminded everyone of the power of honesty, courage, and human insight. In the end, the story was not just about a trial, a judge, or an accused person. It was about a young boy who dared to speak the truth, and in doing so, reminded the world that courage and honesty could come from anyone, anywhere, at any time. The boy's small act had created ripples that would be remembered long after the trial ended, a lasting lesson in the power of truth and the courage to speak it.